This is CBN NewsWatch.
Thank you for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Ephraim Graham. Ahead today, the Prime Minister of Canada facing criticism over declaring a national emergency over truckers' protest of the COVID mandates. He can even freeze those truckers' personal bank accounts. Possible good news from Ukraine as Russia is pulling back some of its troops. An historic visit by the Prime Minister of Israel to one of his country's new Arab allies, the country of Bahrain. Plus, a look at China's influence over politicians, businesses, and more right here in the United States. All those stories and more are ahead in today's edition of CBN NewsWatch. We want to begin with the crackdown in Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has declared a national emergency to end the trucker protest over COVID restrictions. People also now are prevented from crossing the border to participate. Critics blasted Trudeau's move. Some are calling it going too far. And some conservative politicians in Canada say he should simply drop the COVID mandates. CBN's Jenna Browder is following this story for us.
After weeks of protests, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is taking drastic action to put an end to the Freedom Convoy protests.
The time to go home is now.
Trudeau invoking emergency powers, allowing the government to remove cars and trucks, suspend their insurance, and even freeze truckers' personal and corporate bank accounts. He says the powers will be limited in scope and that he's not calling in the military.
The Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country.
Meanwhile, traffic is moving again across the Ambassador Bridge, the busiest land border crossing between the U.S. and Canada.
The blockade at our border in Windsor has now come to an end. The Ambassador Bridge has reopened.
Officials, though, are turning back non-Canadians trying to join the blockade that's brought weeks of protest over vaccine mandates and COVID restrictions to Ottawa and disrupted daily life. On Sunday, 24 people were arrested. Officials are also blocking donations for truckers. A Canadian judge freezing more than $8 million in donations to a crowdfunding site.
This is probably going to be the fight of my life.
Heather Wilson, co-founder of the U.S.-based crowdfunding site GiveSendGo, is fighting back.
We're going to continue this fight for freedom. This is absolutely insane that governments think they can step in and trample on people's God-given rights.
And the company has broad support. So far, nearly $9 million have been raised through GiveSendGo for these truckers. Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Turning now to the crisis over Ukraine, some potentially positive news today as the Russian government announced it is pulling back some troops from the border with Ukraine. Even so, the U.S. said Monday it is temporarily moving the operations of its embassy out of the capital of Kyiv. Diplomatic efforts are also underway to ease tensions. Here's CBN's George Thomas from Ukraine.
Russia's Ministry of Defense says that while large-scale military exercises are continuing across the country, troops that have been deployed to the southern and western districts are beginning to move back. The ministry has released video reportedly showing armored tanks and other equipment being loaded onto trains. The reports of a withdrawal comes as the United States continues to insist that Russia is on the verge of launching a full-scale invasion. The high-stakes efforts to calm tensions continue. Germany's chancellor, who was just here in Ukraine yesterday, is headed to Moscow today for talks with Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, residents here in Lviv, Ukraine's largest city in the western part of the country, are getting an unexpected holiday tomorrow. Ukraine's president has declared February 16th, cited as a possible invasion day, as Unity Day. And he's urging his countrymen to get out the blue and yellow flag and to fly it proudly. George Thomas, CBN News, Lviv, Ukraine.
An historic journey in the Middle East Monday as Israel's Naftali Bennett became the first Israeli prime minister to publicly visit the Gulf Arab state of Bahrain. The trip cementing ties between the new allies in a clear message of cooperation aimed at regional archival Iran. Bennett's visit comes less than 2 weeks after the country signed a defense agreement with an eye on rising tensions in the Gulf. Bennett praised the Abraham Peace Accords agreements brokered under the Trump administration.
We are so excited with the Abraham Accords. This is what the relationship should really be about between Arabs and Jews.
Israel and its new Gulf allies is watching closely as diplomats are currently negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program. CBN recently reported on backlash caused by an Amnesty International report accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. Although the group's mission is to end abuses of human rights, one result of the fallout is from its report has been to shine the light on an important issue that is basically ignored: the policies of the Palestinian Authority. Chris Mitchell brings us that story now from Jerusalem.
The Amnesty International report concluded that Israel's cruel policies of segregation, dispossession, and exclusion across all territories under its control clearly amount to apartheid. Amnesty International said they use the international definition of apartheid. Apartheid most commonly refers to a South African policy of separating blacks and whites, which existed for more than 40 years. It ended in the mid-1990s.
Amnesty and the UN, which is going to be joining the effort, by describing Israel as an apartheid state, isn't getting it wrong. They're getting it the opposite of the truth.
Professor Eugene Kontorovich explains his conclusion in a piece published by the Wall Street Journal titled, "There's apartheid in the Holy Land, but not in Israel."
Israel is a country where Arabs participate in all walks of public life, hold positions in the government. In Israel, Arabs and Jews mingle in cafes, on buses, in all public places. But right next door, in those areas of the Holy Land governed by the Palestinian Authority, real apartheid is practiced.
Kontorovich points out the PA has a law that calls for the death penalty if a Palestinian sells land to a Jew. Back in November, CBN News asked the Palestinian Authority's prime minister about that law.
Land in Palestine is not a real estate issue. Land in Palestine is a political issue. So therefore, the Palestinian law does not allow land to be sold to non-Palestinians.
Another controversial Palestinian government policy is referred to as pay to slay. That program rewards terrorists convicted of killing Jews. The U.S. Congress passed a law called the Taylor Force Act, preventing the U.S. from funding this policy. It's named after an American, Taylor Force, who was killed by a Palestinian in a terror attack.
Israel is not sponsoring a program of pay for slay against Palestinians, whereas the Palestinian government, supported by Western governments, funds a pay for slay program to pay for the murder of Jews.
Kontorovich says through all its laws and policies, the PA has created a Jew-free zone.
When you look at the areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, it's not that there's no separation of Jews and Arabs, there's just no Jews, because they have created a Jew-free state. And they enforce this through official methods.
Despite these policies, it's a situation seldom reported on by Amnesty International, the UN, and other human rights groups. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, influence on Capitol Hill and leverage over the Biden White House. That's what one investigative journalist says China is gaining from big money deals with American elites on both sides of the aisle. We're going to bring in an interview with the man who's exposing it all when we come back. China's brutal persecution of Muslim Uyghurs and Christians led to a global diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics. But some of the same leaders criticizing Beijing's human rights records are personally profiting from business deals with China. Investigative journalist and author Peter Schweitzer exposes how American elites are getting rich while making China even more powerful. Gary Lane is on this story.
The first American president to set foot on Chinese soil.
50 years after President Richard Nixon opened the door to China, the country is on the verge of overtaking the United States as the world's leading economic power. So how did that happen? From Henry Kissinger to the Bush family, the Bidens, and many others, America's elite have helped China become what it is today. On the Global Lane, I spoke with investigative journalist Peter Schweitzer about his new book, Red-Handed: How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win.
American elites in Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C. Have been saying for decades that if we provide China with capital, with access to technology, they would liberalize and become more like us. That hasn't happened. China's actually become more authoritarian. But when they sort of pushed for that bargain, they ended up getting very wealthy by doing deals with Beijing.
Schweizer contends the big money deals are hurting the USA by providing the Chinese Communist Party influence on Capitol Hill and leverage over the Biden White House.
We looked at those deals that the Bidens got. There's basically 5 deals. And we looked at the businessmen in China who made that happen. And what we found is that in every single case, those businessmen had ties to the highest levels of Chinese intelligence. So this is not just a corruption story now. It has a very strong tint of intelligence, espionage, and spying. Where does Joe Biden fit into this? The assumption has been this is all Hunter sort of freelancing. What the new information makes clear is that Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, when he was vice president, and I think probably up to this day, have intermingled finances, meaning that Hunter Biden was paying Joe Biden's bills while he was vice president of the United States. So that means that while Hunter Biden is collecting the money, one of the beneficiaries of that money is Joe Biden himself.
So what does this mean now that Biden is president and China is making threatening moves against Taiwan, the South China Sea, elsewhere? Is the U.S. president in a compromised position?
I believe he is.
Furthermore, Schweizer believes Congress should immediately hold a joint investigation into the Biden family business dealings with China, although he points out why he thinks that is unlikely.
The problem is that you have a lot of people on Capitol Hill from both political parties who also have deals with Beijing. So they're not particularly interested in highlighting the commercial ties that the Bidens have, even though they are tinged with these relationships with senior levels of Chinese intelligence.
It would open a whole Pandora's box on Capitol Hill. You talk about Senator Feinstein, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Republicans and Democrats, I might add. Their family members have business relationships with China. Are the dealings unethical or criminal?
I don't know if they violate laws. I'm not a lawyer, but they're certainly highly unethical. I mean, look, you look at any of them, whether it's Mitch McConnell and his family's shipping business, by which all of their ships are built by the Chinese government. All the crews are provided by the Chinese government. The financing of the ships is provided by the Chinese government. The contracts to ship goods around the world are provided by the Chinese government. They have complete leverage over him. You could look at the Pelosi's, you could look at the Feinsteins, you can find the exact same thing. This is an enormous problem of vulnerability that a foreign power that has been quite open in saying they want to supplant the United States as the supreme power on the planet, that our leaders have commercial ties that puts them at the mercy of their whims. That's a huge problem for our country, and we need to address it immediately.
And the outside influence extends way beyond the Washington power corridors. Schweizer believes Silicon Valley's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party poses a dangerous threat to America's technological and economic future.
President Xi of China has said that if China can become the superior power in artificial intelligence, they will seize the commanding heights of the competition with the United States. What is Google doing? What is Microsoft doing? They are actually funding artificial intelligence research at laboratories in China that are linked to the Chinese military, that are helping them in their competition with us.
And wealthy friends of the CCP are influencing American colleges and universities. In his book, Schweizer writes about NBA owner Alibaba Vice President Joe Tsai, who donated $30 million to Yale.
These executives linked to Chinese companies like Joe Tsai try to hide the fact that the money's coming from overseas. They list this as a donation from Tsai's American Foundation, but that American Foundation has no assets according to tax filings. He's really pulling the money from his other foundations overseas. And the reason they try to conceal it is Yale University and other colleges are required to list foreign donations with the U.S. Department of Education. It's a problem not just at Yale, but at campuses from Stanford to the East Coast. And again, they try to hide that these donations are coming from China, and it is influencing the debate on our college campuses.
So what needs to be done to reverse course? Schweizer recommends several steps, including new laws against Chinese media and propaganda companies to prevent them from influencing American public discourse. He also believes strict limits should be placed on Chinese lobbying.
There are at least 23 former U.S. senators and members of Congress that are lobbying in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Chinese military or intelligence-linked companies. I believe that Americans have a constitutional right to petition their government, which amounts to lobbying. I don't believe that right should extend to Chinese military and intelligence-linked companies. So we need to ban lobbying by these companies in Washington, D.C.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Still ahead, technology gaining an ever more important place in our life, especially our social lives, with so much taking place online. So what does God think about the role technology is playing? We're going to explore this with an analyst right after this. From smartphones to self-driving cars to space travel, there is no doubt technology's evolution is moving at warp speed. Our cell phone not only acts as a computer, but it can now monitor your heart rate, sleep cycle, and oxygen levels. It is also the gateway to our social lives. So what does God think of our relationship with technology and the role that it plays in our lives? CBN News' The Prayer Link program spoke with a journalist and author who says we should not leave God out of that conversation.
For about a century now, the church's theologians have implied that faith and technology really don't belong in the same conversation. Human innovation is Babel-like, it's worldly, it's tainted top to bottom by sin, and potentially very destructive. So whenever you speak of human tech, just leave God out of the conversation. And that's largely what Christians have done for a century. And now we find ourselves inside the most technologically advanced society the world has ever seen. And the church doesn't know what to say. I mean, we don't know what to say to Christians who work inside major tech centers. We don't know what to say to Christians who want to go into engineering. And so there's a growing desire to ask the question whether we got this right over those years, or maybe we lost something on the way. And so what I did is I returned to Scripture and looked at the dozen or so key biblical texts that we have in the Bible that would give us some implications into how we think of modern day big tech, and kind of develop those out.
So why write a book about God and technology?
Yeah, I think it's because of this growing gap in the church not knowing what to say. What do we say about war tech? What do we say about smartphones? What do we say about social media? What do we say about what it means to be a Christian in the society that God has given us today? And it's so technologically rich. And so we wake up in the morning and we use 10,000 innovations every single day, and we just take them all for granted. We don't know how to thank God for the things that we have: the lighting, the electricity, the computers, the smartphones, the cameras, the layers of innovation we're using right now to speak and to broadcast this message. And so what I wanted to do is bring him back into the conversation so that we can see his generosity, because he is an incredibly generous God in the creation he's given us and given us to develop.
Amen.
Awesome. And Tony, in your book, you say technology will ultimately serve the purpose of flourishing God's people. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's the whole purpose of the universe, is for the son to get a bride. I mean, that is why everything exists. That's why every atom exists. That's why every person on the planet, every political ruler, every war machine, every smartphone, every camera, all the electricity we have, the self-driving cars, all of it exists within this one single plan for God to give his son a bride, the church. And so we know that that's the final purpose and goal of all things. And now it's just a matter of having faith to see that throughout all the technologies that we have, God is bringing about that plan. Whatever he's doing in Ukraine right now, he's bringing about that plan. And it's hard for us to see that in the ebbs and flows of the drama of human innovation and the drama of human geopolitical tensions. But that's what he's ultimately about. That's ultimately what he's bringing about by faith. We can see that in Scripture and see everything else that we have, all the innovations, all the electricity, the cars, all the innovations we use every single day. It's all for that final purpose.
And you can catch more of this interview on a new episode of The Prayer Link. It begins tonight at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. You can find it on the CBN News Channel. You can also find it on demand by downloading the CBN News app. Coming up, what happens after we die? A new film examines that very important question. And we'll have a look when we come back. Stay with us. Famed author and former atheist Lee Strobel is turning his latest book into a documentary film that explores what awaits us after death. In The Case for Heaven, Strobel seeks to answer questions about the afterlife, heaven and hell, and what really happens during near-death experiences.
whole point of the resurrection is that I wouldn't have to fear it in a sense of, oh no, what's going to happen next?
I didn't really care whether I was going to heaven or hell.
I have absolutely no idea what happens after we die.
There's something that it is to be us. There's something that it is like to be you.
When we die, we leave our natural bodies, but we're still ourselves. It's life on steroids. It's life beyond anything we've experienced.
Strobel says the pandemic has many people thinking about what happens after death. He says the movie provides compelling evidence from inside and outside the Bible to show that we do live on. It is based on his book, The Case for Heaven. A journalist investigates evidence for life after death. It was inspired by Strobel's own near-death experience and includes interviews with world-renowned pastor Francis Chan, best-selling author John Burke, evangelist Luis Palau, and more. It will debut in theaters on April 4th, 5th, and 6th. Time now for your Tuesday Tweetable. This is a message I pray will bless you, and I hope you will post, tag, tweet, and share it with those in your circles of influence. Know this: in your prayers for peace, God isn't going to isolate you from chaos, but He will quiet your heart in the middle of the trouble. With that word, I encourage you to make today a terrific Tuesday and make sure that you are living life on purpose and with purpose. That is going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. Remember, you can always find more of our programs on the CBN News Channel. You can find them there at any time as well as online at cbnnews.com. We'd love to know what you think about the stories you've seen here today or any day. You can email us at the address right there at the bottom of your screen, newswatch@cbn.com. You can also reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We certainly would love to hear from you. Again, I encourage you to make this a terrific Tuesday and join us right back here, same time tomorrow. Goodbye. God bless.